Hello, hola, shalom, bonjour, ciao, ni hao, jambo, and saluton. I'm Jamie Gilpatrick, the Managing Director at Bristol Riverside Theatre. I'm here in our scene shop just a few miles up the road from the theatre, where construction is underway for the set of the third production of the main stage season, the contemporary play The Language Archive. Have you ever stopped to think about the importance of language? Maybe you studied a foreign language in school, or grew up with family members who spoke another language. Through these experiences, you may have developed a sense of the diversity of languages and the cultures they are a product of. Language is how people communicate, correct? Well, yes and no. Language is critical to communication, but language and communication are not synonymous. Have you ever found yourself in a place where your primary language was not spoken and you needed to communicate something? You'll usually find a way. Likewise, there are people who are well-versed in a language or even several languages and who are very poor communicators. Such is the case with the character of George in our play. George is a linguist who specializes in dying languages. Yet for all his knowledge, he is painfully unskilled in expressing himself, especially when it comes to conveying his emotions, namely love. The Language Archive was written by the Asian-American playwright Julia Cho. Cho studied Spanish, French, and German in school, and while she grew up in a Korean-speaking household, she never learned that particular language. In a 2010 Village Voice article, Cho said, "It's a huge source of regret and guilt that I don't speak Korean. That guilt inspired this play." Cho was intrigued by the fact that a world language dies every 2 weeks and began researching exactly why they disappear. The Language Archive asks us to consider the fact that words sometimes fail us, even when we try our best to communicate with one another. Think about when you read a text or an email, how often do you perceive an undertone in the message that does not bear out? We are predisposed to not rely on words alone. Human emotional experiences like love and grief cannot be adequately expressed by any language. So please join me now as we look at our production of this engaging, charming, contemporary play, Dankegon, which means thank you.
I'm Hallie Korne. I'm a research associate with the Recovering Voices Initiative at the Smithsonian Institute in the Department of Anthropology, and I hold a PhD in educational linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. I have been working in the area of language endangerment and language revitalization for about 10 years now. This is a booming branch of linguistics. There are an estimated 7,000 languages in the world today. It's very difficult for linguists to pinpoint exactly how many languages we have. The number that the linguist in the play puts forward is 6,900, but new languages are discovered all the time, so that number keeps changing. So we don't know exactly how many languages we have, but we do know that many of the languages in the world are endangered. There are fewer and fewer people speaking them, fewer and fewer opportunities and social domains in which languages are used. And linguists, as well as anthropologists and educators, are attempting to address what is considered a crisis of language endangerment in different parts of the world. And there's different ways that scholars and scientists are addressing this crisis. The way that George, the linguist in the play, approaches is through archiving languages, documenting languages to then preserve them in a museum-like atmosphere. There's also many initiatives going on within different minoritized communities, indigenous communities, where endangered languages are spoken, which attempt to create more social domains and more positive attitudes and greater value for the languages so that they will continue to be used within their communities of origin. And that's the area that I work in more personally as an educator and someone who promotes multilingual education. In the United States, for instance, there's over 300 indigenous languages that are spoken today, and the majority of them are considered endangered. For many decades, the policy of the US government was to assimilate or annihilate indigenous languages. This trend of language endangerment can very much be linked to colonialism and imperialism, as certain languages like English and certain political powers have gone out and exerted their force and their dominance in other parts of the world. And that's a theme that we see coming out in the play, where the characters say that English is the language of the men with guns. And unfortunately, that has been true in many parts of the world. Many of the languages that are minoritized and endangered is because of political conflicts and domination of certain languages and certain groups over others. So in the United States, we've seen a great threat to the indigenous languages of this area. The language that's indigenous to Pennsylvania, for instance, Lenape, is no longer spoken here in Pennsylvania because of the 1875 Indian Removal Act that caused all native Lenape speakers to be moved to reservations in Oklahoma. So those kind of political and historical processes have really changed the linguistic landscape of the US and have caused certain languages to disappear over time. So for many members of communities that are experiencing language displacement or language endangerment, it's often a very difficult position to be in. Parents want to provide their children the best opportunities they can, and if the political and economic environment is pressuring them to move towards a language like English, because they love their children, will often make that choice to not speak their heritage language, not speak this endangered language, and instead speak the colonial language, the imperial language, or the now perceived as global language of English. And this is also felt with a lot of sadness by many members of indigenous communities and endangered language communities. They very much value their heritage language, they value their ways of communicating that have been passed down from their ancestors. However, due to political and economic pressures, it becomes harder and harder to maintain those ways of speaking and those ways of communicating. Fortunately, today there are more and more opportunities for endangered language communities to resist and respond to these pressures. Since 1990, the US government has recognized Native American languages as legitimate languages, and more indigenous communities in North America are undertaking initiatives to teach their language, to document it, to use it in social media and online. It's a very active area of language revitalization and promotion of endangered languages. One of the themes that as a linguist, that I love in this play is the issue of intelligibility or lack of intelligibility. How do we understand people who come from a different cultural or linguistic environment? Or how do we understand people who come from the very same environment we come from, and yet we somehow are not able to achieve basic communication? This is really the fascination of language that draws many linguists to this field and keeps us fascinated, because human communication is immensely complex. It's not a formula that can be solved. It's not something that can be documented in a clean way, even though as linguists we attempt to document different languages and different systems of communication. We know that there's always more to it than that. There's always subtleties and different meanings and different communicational intent that we cannot capture and we cannot predict. So that to me is the fascination of language and the beauty of this play, to really bring out those subtleties and those complexities that arise inevitably in multilingual and multicultural contexts, but are also present in monolingual and monocultural contexts.
The Language Archive is full of heart. It's one of my favorite plays because it's so exquisitely written. The language is full of poetry, it's full of musicality, it's rich in images and in metaphor. But at core, it's a play about how we come to understand each other and how we come to communicate our feelings towards each other. And that to me is so exciting and so rich. One of the great joys of working on a play like The Language Archive is creating the world for it to live in. The play has such tight pace in how it's written, and it wants to be done at a certain rhythm, and you don't want to slow it down for scene changes, for shifting of furniture. So we had to create a world in which we could leap from location to location, from tone to tone, without stopping everything. And that was a great joy to work on and a great challenge. We have 3 weeks in the rehearsal room to work on this play before the first public performance. And that's an incredibly tight amount of time for a play like this. It's technically complicated because of the scene shifts and the way the world moves, but it's also a very big challenge for the actors. The emotional places that this play takes them to are pretty enormous, and yet they sometimes have to shift instantly from one character to another, from one moment to another, leaping in time. And that's really hard to do without more time in the room. I'm very fortunate in this company to have a tremendous group of actors. They all had to have a great facility with language. Some of them have to play multiple characters, each with their own dialect, some of whom are speaking different languages as well, sometimes not the language of their dialect. They had to have a great technical speed and agility to do this kind of work, but also they had to be the kind of actors who could bring enormous heart to it. Because at core, it's a love story, and it's a story about love itself. And this group of actors is really bringing it. One of my favorite moments in this play comes in Act 1, when Ulta, one of the characters, talks about how languages die and says to the scientist, George, you think that the loss of a language is the loss of a world, but in fact, the world dies first, the language follows. To me, there's something profoundly moving about that sentiment and idea, about the idea that languages hold our worlds and are the residue of our worlds. And it's a touching moment. One of the things to look for in this play is the metaphor. The language is so rich and thick, and it's like poetry. But if you listen carefully over and over, it unfolds and unpacks in new and interesting ways. And you hear a bit of dialogue that then reflects over and over again in a prism in different angles by different characters as the play goes on. And to me, that's one of the things that makes the language archive so rich and so exciting. Finding the authenticity of each of these characters has been a particular challenge because two of the characters, the L ones, are from a made-up place, an unspecified location. We don't even know what continent it's on. So we had to work closely with both the costume designer and the dialect coach to try to imagine what that world would be and what the behavior would be like in that world, but also what the sounds that the characters make, what they wear, what they're used to, what they're not used to. So it's about finding an authenticity that is true to itself, even though it's not particularly true to any one individual culture. Because in fact, the more time you spend guessing where they're from, I think the more you're distracted from the ideas of the play. And then, of course, also we have characters that are from very specific places, other characters who are from here or there, and we have to match those as closely as possible. So authenticity has different ways of functioning in this play, and that's been really exciting and interesting to work on. My family spoke English, except my father and stepmother spoke German when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. But I think a lot about Yiddish when I listen to this play. My great-grandparents spoke Yiddish. My grandparents basically forbade it from being spoke in the house, so my mother never learned it. I never learned it. It was a culture that wasn't passed on. It was a world that died with them. And you know, that's an assimilationist idea. That's sometimes how languages die. And yet, what was lost? What wasn't passed on? What wasn't received? I think about that a lot when I listen to this play.
A dialect coach comes on when there is a play that's been written with different accents in them. So they come in and they work with various actors on refining that dialect. They work with the director on what their needs are. Every director is different. They might want a light dialect or a strong dialect. And a lot of actors in the professional world actually audition with the dialect, so a lot of times you're just fine-tuning it. And then in some cases, you're just starting from scratch and teaching them everything about the way they're supposed to talk, where a dialect sits in the voice. It might be in the throat, it might be a little more forward, tempo, rhythm, cadence. I became a dialect coach kind of by mistake. I was never looking for it. And what's funny about that is so many other dialect coaches I have talked to, a lot of friends and colleagues, feel the same exact way. They said they stumbled upon it by accident. They weren't looking for it. I was in graduate school getting my MFA, and our head of voice and speech was really drawn to me in the work I was doing. And I have a voice background, being a singer and coaching singers. And she was in the midst of leaving the program and starting another program somewhere else. So in the meantime, she turned over the undergraduate classes to me, and I was scared. So I kind of just jumped into it with her training me and got started and fell in love with it. It was something I didn't know I would love, but she knew, and she has a great eye. So then I started doing that and teaching it, and coaching shows and doing more and more. And so when I came back to the New York area, I got certified with a speech technician, and then just took off running with it and haven't looked back since. Preparing for a fictitious language as LOA in this show was a challenge and a fun one, because I've never worked on a show where you had to literally make up the dialect. So we started with the fact that it is a Slavic language, and there are specific characteristics about Slavic languages, whether it's Russian or from any of the stans. And then from there, we played with it. So one way that dialects are distinguished from one another is the use of an R. So some R's are trilled, some R's are guttural, sometimes there's no R at all in dialects. So we decided to trill the R. So adding in the Slavic sounds that usually don't have a trilled R, and then adding in a trilled R to it, that gives it a little bit of a musicality as well. So it was fun to play with. And I read in an interview somewhere that a lot of the languages, whether they're Russian or Hungarian or one of the stans, you actually can't tell them apart if they're speaking English. It's when they're doing their own language that you know the differences. So it was kind of fun to be able to play in that world, but not have to worry so much about, okay, does it sound like this one or that one? And then just being able to play with the R's. So this show has many challenges, especially for two of the actors who play multiple roles. They have to go from LOA to German. One has to be a stronger German than the other, to American. And so jumping from so many dialects with one actor is such a challenge to switch. It's so much easier to do a show when you know you're on the same path the whole time and you're in that rhythm. So the challenge has been working to give them ways into finding these switches really, really quickly. When watching this show, I think what would be fun to look for from a dialect perspective is the use of the R. Like I've said, the R's are what distinguish different accents from each other. So notice how much work they've put into whether it's a rolled R or saying the R at all or not saying the R. Other things that they can listen for are the use of consonants. Are they hard consonants? Are they soft consonants? We've worked really hard where the Eloin dialect is sort of back in the throat, and then the German is forward, and it's not as, the consonants are a little more breathy. So that's kind of some details that are fun to look for. So one thing I thought about when coming into this project about the Slavic languages is my next door neighbor is Polish. Although that's not what we're going for in this, there are so many similarities. So listening to him helps so much with my work and what I could bring to the plate for this, the way he does his R's, the way he's big in his throat when he talks to me. There's so many similars of that to a Russian/Slavic language. Also, I did coach a show where somebody had to be Hungarian, and it had the same exact kind of thing. And for that show, what I did is I went to a Hungarian restaurant, and the owners of the restaurant, it was a tiny little place near Trenton, New Jersey. The owners of the restaurant spoke broken English. So I went in there, talked to them, ordered a little bit of food, and recorded them telling stories, and then recorded them saying lines. So I brought a lot of that research from a few years back into this process because I think the Elowen is really fun. So I really enjoy working on that. The German is great too, but I think because we get to create the Elowen language, it brings you to such a fun character place to let it live a little in the back. It adds so much to the texture of who these people are. So I would say the Elowin's been a lot of fun.
One of our main challenges during the show is figuring out what the balance is actually going to be for recorded sound versus live sound. Do we actually want to create some things that seem like live sounds in the show? One of the things that we actually ended up doing was adding some triggers to the doors. Most of the time during the show, the doors will magically open and close, but there were some points then where we wanted to actually have the sounds of real doors opening and closing, that to simulate the actors actually going through the doors, a real door. So what we ended up doing is we're putting some triggers into the door frame themselves, and those triggers, whenever you open or close the door, it sends a little relay message to the soundboard, and that actually plays the cues. So then it was a matter of finding, okay, well, do we want all the doors to sound the same? Will some of them be a little bit different? So some of that stuff was going into the show and trying to figure out how to tailor each moment. So things that you wouldn't necessarily think were important, like a basic door opening and closing, ended up being a little bit of a challenge for the show. So for this show, there are moments that stick to strict realism, and there are other moments that obviously do not have much realism at all. And I think for the balance of this show, I would actually say that it tends to be less realistic than most things. So there are moments where we might emphasize a certain rhythm, like having it feel like a heartbeat happening in one scene or something like that. And there are other moments where we might just give a little hint of something realistic. So if they're in the hospital, maybe you'll hear a few little beeps of one machine, but nothing else of the actual hospital sound itself to give you that form of realism that you might think would obviously be there. One of the things is, after a while, things like that tend to get in the way of the show. If you were constantly hearing a beeping of a machine, it might start to drive you crazy after a little while. So in theater, we tend to play around with the fact that we set these things up and then take it away so that it's not so distracting to the audience. When it comes to figuring out the concept for the show, it's a little bit of a mix between the director and the designer doing it. So it's really a collaboration. With something like this, the director, Adam Mimivar, had an idea of what he wanted to do with the show, and have things be a little less real. Like for certain things, we're not actually seeing some of the props on stage, but we're hearing some of the things that the props actually do. So that was his concept that he came to me with, and then from there I got to kind of decide, okay, if that's how we want to approach the show, where are these different times that we're actually going to try that? And what will some of those sounds be? Like, do we actually care to hear somebody writing on the chalkboard, if we're not actually doing that? And trying to figure out how much we're going to actually gain from doing some things like that in the show. So really it's taking the director's basic concept and then playing off of that, where then I get to go ahead and have fun and explore different things. The music choices for the show are, well, first of all, they're kind of few and far between. There are only a few moments in the show that we actually use music. Otherwise, we try to keep the flow of the show going so that we don't lose any momentum. So at the beginning of the show, that you'll notice that we hear some feedback right to start off with. Just basically letting the audience know that, this is going to be a little bit different than your normal show, and we're not afraid to go ahead and make some annoying sounds every once in a while. What we wanted to do in choosing things like the feedback or the other sounds that compose the music was taking different sounds that would go along with recording. Since we're talking about the language archive and the fact that they're recording different voices and stuff, we wanted to play around with the idea of computerized sounds, synthesized sounds, and just general sounds of recordings. And so you'll hear a little bit of that throughout the show. I think my favorite moment in the show actually tends to be the moment where we kind of quickly go in and out of reality. When we're all of a sudden, you're having an aside moment where you're talking to one of the actors, and then you stop having that moment and you get automatically pulled back into the play. And the idea of, what are the subtle sounds that might be going along with that? Do we want to hear a difference in something that is the normal action of the play versus that moment when we're actually pulled out of it? My family was, the typical American household. We didn't actually speak much foreign language. My parents only spoke English. The fun part was my aunt, who is actually a nun. She is a a nun who went and lived in Peru and Chile and a number of different countries. She would teach the Spanish-speaking kids English as part of her work there with the church. And it was, I always heard the stories about, how the great things that she was actually doing there, teaching the kids. And whenever she actually came home to visit, which unfortunately was not very often because she was so busy, I would go and try to listen to her and figure out as much as I could, figuring out those new words and stuff that she had for me. I remember playing Uno with her all the time. For some reason, when I was 7 years old, I thought it was the greatest thing that I could say Uno or dos, some of those basic numbers, something that I kind of take advantage of, take it for granted these days. But I thought that was great. My wonderful aunt the nun was teaching me something.
Calkins Media, not your traditional newspaper company. Utilizing the power of 6 daily and 2 weekly newspapers plus 3 ABC TV affiliates reaching 3.4 million people each week.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Carol Erickson with your 8 a.m. Courier Times news break. Here's what you need to know as you head out the door this morning.
Hyper local news. The most resources of any news organization, including broadcast. Hyper local programming, including sports. Not a sports fan? No problem. Almost everyone likes to eat and save money. But there's more. Already using our impressive resources to serve our customers and our partners, we're growing our product and want our partners to grow their customer base as well. Calkins Media, not your traditional newspaper company.